Sarah Chen stood at Gate B7 of Hartsfield-Jackson Atlanta International Airport, her crisp pilot's uniform perfectly pressed and her shoulders straight with the confidence that came from 15 years of flying commercial aircraft. The early morning sunlight streamed through the large terminal windows, casting a warm glow on her face as she checked her phone one last time before boarding Flight 2314 to Chicago. As a deadheading crew member, Sarah was supposed to ride in the designated crew seats to position herself for her next flight assignment in Chicago. She had done this hundreds of times before, and the process was usually smooth and routine. Today, however, would prove to be different. The gate area was crowded with the usual mix of business travelers in suits and families heading out on vacation. Sarah noticed a few curious glances from passengers as she waited to board, but she was used to that. Being one of the few black female pilots in commercial aviation meant she often drew attention, though she never let it bother her. Now boarding all passengers for Flight 2314 to Chicago O'Hare, the gate agent announced over the speaker system. Sarah waited patiently, knowing crew members would board after the first-class passengers. When it was her turn, she walked confidently toward the jet bridge, her pilot's bag rolling smoothly behind her. The gate agent smiled and nodded as she scanned Sarah's crew ID, but the first sign of trouble came when she stepped onto the aircraft. A new flight attendant, Lisa Murray, stood at the entrance of the plane. She was young, probably in her mid-20s, with blonde hair pulled back in a tight bun. As Sarah approached, Lisa's welcoming smile faltered slightly. "Excuse me, ma'am," Lisa said, her voice carrying a note of confusion. "I'll need to see your boarding pass." Sarah reached into her uniform pocket and pulled out her crew ID along with her deadheading papers. "I'm crew," she explained calmly. "Deadheading to Chicago for tomorrow morning's flight." Lisa glanced at the documents, then back at Sarah, her brow furrowed. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice loud enough that nearby passengers turned to look. "These can't be right. The crew seats are reserved for airline personnel only." Sarah took a deep breath, maintaining her professional composure. "Yes, I understand. I am airline personnel. I'm a senior pilot with the airline, deadheading to Chicago." The situation began drawing more attention as passengers trying to board were forced to wait behind Sarah. Some started pulling out their phones, sensing the tension in the air. "I'm going to have to ask you to move to your assigned seat in economy," Lisa insisted, her cheeks flushing red. "We can sort this out after everyone's boarded." Sarah felt a familiar weight in her chest, the kind that came from years of dealing with similar assumptions and prejudices. But her mother had taught her long ago that maintaining dignity in the face of ignorance was its own form of strength. "I understand there might be some confusion," Sarah said, her voice steady and clear, "but I assure you these credentials are valid. You can verify with the captain if you'd like." More passengers had stopped to watch now, and Sarah could hear whispers behind her. An elderly gentleman in first class lowered his newspaper, his eyes moving between Sarah and Lisa with growing interest. The tension in the cabin grew thicker as Lisa reached for her phone to call the gate supervisor. Sarah remained standing, straight-backed and professional, though inside she felt a mix of frustration and sadness. After thousands of flight hours, hundreds of successful landings, and years of breaking barriers in aviation, she was still being questioned about her right to be there. What Sarah didn't know at that moment was that this incident would soon become much more than a simple misunderstanding. The next few minutes would not only change her day but would spark a conversation that would reach far beyond Flight 2314 and the walls of this aircraft. As Lisa made her call, more phones came out to record the scene, and the elderly passenger in first class slowly began to rise from the seat. The events that would unfold in the next few minutes would leave everyone on that plane stunned, and remind them all that sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the most unexpected moments. The stage was set for what would become a viral moment in aviation history, though none of the passengers settling into their seats could have predicted just how this story would end. As Flight 2314 reached its cruising altitude, there was a palpable sense of anticipation in the cabin. The seatbelt signs dinged off, and passengers settled in, many still discussing the events that had transpired during boarding. The young girl who had asked Sarah if she was a real pilot kept glancing hopefully toward the cockpit. Captain Martinez's voice came over the intercom first. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're now cruising at 35,000 feet. The weather ahead looks clear. and we're expecting a smooth flight to Chicago. I have someone special who would like to share a few words with you today." There was a slight pause, and then Sarah's confident voice filled the cabin. "Good morning, everyone. I'm Captain Sarah Chen, and I'd like to tell you a story about how I fell in love with flying." The cabin grew quiet as passengers leaned in to listen. Even the flight attendants, including Lisa, paused their service to hear Sarah's words. "When I was 7 years old, my father took me to an air show," Sarah began. "I watched in amazement as planes painted trails across the sky. But what truly changed my life was meeting a pilot that day, not because of what they did, but because of what they said to me. They told me that the sky belongs to everyone who dares to reach for it." Sarah continued, her voice carrying emotion that touched everyone listening. "I won't pretend the journey was easy. There were many people who told me I couldn't or shouldn't. But for every person who doubted, there was someone else who believed, like Mr. Morrison back there in first class, who just stood up for me." Lisa, who was standing in the galley, felt tears welling up in her eyes. The weight of her earlier actions pressed heavily on her conscience, but Sarah's words carried no bitterness. "To the young girl who asked if I was really a pilot," Sarah said, causing the 8-year-old to sit up straighter in her seat, "and to everyone else who has ever been told they don't belong somewhere, remember this: your dreams don't need anyone's permission to take flight." The girl's mother, who had been recording the announcement on her phone, wiped away a tear. Her daughter sat transfixed, her eyes shining with possibility. Sarah went on to explain some fascinating aspects of flying: how planes stay in the air, what those different sounds during flight mean, and what it feels like to soar above the clouds. She made complex concepts simple enough for everyone to understand, and her passion for aviation was infectious. As she spoke, something remarkable happened in the cabin. Passengers who had been strangers just moments ago began sharing their own stories with each other. A businessman in row 14 talked about his daughter who was studying aerospace engineering. A teacher in row 23 discussed how she would use this story to inspire her students. Halfway through the flight, Lisa gathered her courage and approached the cockpit during a quiet moment. When Sarah emerged to speak with her, Lisa's apology came from a place of genuine understanding rather than just embarrassment. "Captain Chen," Lisa began, her voice trembling slightly, "I want you to know that I'm not just sorry for what I did. I'm grateful for how you handled it. You could have reported me, had me suspended, but instead, you turned it into a lesson for everyone, including me." Sarah looked at the young flight attendant with kindness. "Lisa, we all have moments we wish we could take back. What matters is what we do next. Would you like to help me with something?" Lisa nodded eagerly. "I noticed several children on board who seemed interested in aviation. What do you say we give them a little tour of the cockpit after we land? With the captain's permission, of course." Lisa's face lit up at the suggestion. "I'll help organize it," she said, already thinking about how to arrange the visits efficiently. As Sarah returned to the cockpit, she could hear the continued buzz of conversation throughout the cabin. Her story had sparked something, not just a discussion about aviation, but about dreams, prejudices, and the power of responding to ignorance with grace. The flight was more than halfway to Chicago now, but the real journey of change was just beginning. Unknown to everyone on board, someone's viral video of the boarding incident was already spreading across social media, and Sarah's powerful message would soon reach far beyond the confines of Flight 2314. In the cabin, the young girl who had asked if Sarah was a real pilot was now drawing pictures of airplanes on her tablet, adding a stick figure with a pilot's uniform that looked remarkably like Sarah. Her mother watched with a proud smile, knowing that today's flight would be remembered not for its destination, but for its impact on her daughter's dreams. As Flight 2314 began its initial descent into Chicago O'Hare International Airport, the video of the boarding incident had already gained over 100,000 views on social media. Comments were pouring in from around the world. What the viral video hadn't captured, however, was the remarkable transformation that had taken place during the flight. The cabin had become something of a makeshift community, with passengers from different walks of life engaged in meaningful conversations about breaking barriers and challenging assumptions. In row 17, a mother from Nigeria was sharing stories with her seatmate about her daughter's struggles in medical school, drawing parallels to Sarah's journey. "Sometimes," she said, "all it takes is one person to show others what's possible." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted as the plane descended through the clouds. Lisa, who had been deeply affected by the day's events, approached Sarah during a quiet moment with an unexpected request. "Captain Chen," she said, her voice stronger now than during her earlier apology, "would you be willing to speak at our airline's next flight attendant training session? I think your story could help prevent others from making the same mistake I did." Sarah was touched by the sincerity of Lisa's growth. "I'd be honored," she replied. "Sometimes the best teaching moments come from our most difficult experiences." As they spoke, James Morrison made his way forward from first class, holding his phone with a bemused expression. "You might want to see this, Sarah," he said, showing her the screen. "My granddaughter's already seen the video. She's doing a live stream about women in aviation, and it's gone viral too." The pilot smiled, remembering the enthusiastic young girl from her previous flight. The ripple effects of today's events were spreading faster than she could have imagined. Captain Martinez's voice came over the intercom, announcing their final approach into Chicago. As the plane descended, Sarah noticed something extraordinary through the cockpit window. 2 fire trucks were positioned near their assigned gate, but not for an emergency. They were there for a water cannon salute, a rare honor typically reserved for retiring pilots or inaugural flights. It turned out that the airport staff had seen the viral video and decided to arrange this special welcome. As the aircraft taxied under the graceful arcs of water, passengers pressed against their windows, many recording the moment on their phones. The young girl who had been so inspired by Sarah earlier couldn't contain her excitement. "Mom, look, it's like a rainbow tunnel," she exclaimed as the water droplets caught the sunlight, creating pristine arcs over the aircraft. When the plane finally came to a stop at the gate, no one rushed to get up as they typically would. Instead, spontaneous applause broke out, spreading through the cabin like a wave. Sarah's voice came over the intercom one final time. "Thank you all for being part of this unexpected journey today," she said warmly. "Before we disembark, I'd like to invite all our young passengers who are interested in aviation to visit the cockpit. And remember, the sky belongs to everyone who dares to reach for it." Lisa, who had been helping arrange the cockpit visits, noticed something remarkable. It wasn't just children lining up, there were adults too, each wanting to speak with Sarah, to share their own stories or simply express their gratitude. As passengers began to deplane, a gate agent rushed aboard with urgent news. Major news networks had picked up the story, and reporters were gathered in the terminal, hoping to interview Sarah. But she held up her hand, smiling gently. "The interviews can wait," she said. "I promised these children a tour of the cockpit, and that comes first." For the next 30 minutes, Sarah patiently explained every dial, switch, and button to wide-eyed children and equally fascinated adults. She made sure to speak to each person individually, paying special attention to the young girl who had first asked if she was a real pilot. As the last passengers left the aircraft, Lisa approached Sarah one final time. "I learned something invaluable today," she said. "Change doesn't always come from big moments or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes from how we handle the small moments, the everyday interactions." Sarah nodded, understanding the deeper meaning behind Lisa's words. As they gathered their belongings to leave the aircraft, both women knew that while Flight 2314 had reached its destination, the journey it had started was far from over. Outside, journalists waited with their cameras, and social media continued to buzz with the story, but the real impact was in the hearts and minds of those who had witnessed firsthand how grace and dignity could transform a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for growth and understanding. The elderly passenger who stood up was James Morrison, a retired pilot who had flown for the airline for over 3 decades. He had been quietly observing the situation unfold from his first-class seat, and something about Sarah's calm demeanor struck a chord in his memory. "Excuse me," he called out, his voice carrying the weight of authority that came from years in the cockpit. "I believe I can help clear this up." He made his way carefully to where Sarah and Lisa stood, moving with deliberate steps despite his age. Lisa turned toward him, relief crossing her face at the prospect of support from another passenger. However, what happened next took her completely by surprise. "This is Captain Sarah Chen," James announced, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. "She flew me and my family from Denver to Miami just last month. One of the smoothest landings I've ever experienced, and I've seen plenty in my 40 years of flying." The atmosphere in the cabin shifted instantly. Passengers who had been filming the confrontation on their phones continued recording, but now with renewed interest. Lisa's face paled as she looked between James and Sarah. "I remember that flight, Mr. Morrison," Sarah said with a warm smile. "Your granddaughter visited the cockpit after we landed. She told me she wants to be a pilot too." James beamed at the memory. "That she did. Haven't heard the end of it since. She's got your picture on her wall now, right next to Amelia Earhart." More passengers had gathered around now, their initial impatience turning to interest as they witnessed the exchange. A young girl, perhaps 12 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve and whispered excitedly, "Mom, she's a real pilot." Meanwhile, Lisa stood frozen, her phone still in her hand, the gate supervisor forgotten on the other end of the line. The reality of her mistake was beginning to sink in, and embarrassment colored her cheeks. Just then, the captain of Flight 2314, David Martinez, emerged from the cockpit, having been alerted to the commotion by another flight attendant. His eyes widened in recognition as he saw Sarah. "Sarah, I didn't know you were date-heading with us today," he said, extending his hand in greeting. "Everyone, Captain Chen here is one of our most experienced pilots. She's actually the one who helped develop our new safety protocols last year." The passengers who had been recording now lowered their phones, many looking ashamed for having assumed the worst. Lisa's hands trembled slightly as she realized the magnitude of her error. "Captain Chen, I'm so sorry," Lisa stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I should never have assumed." Sarah raised her hand gently, stopping Lisa's apology. "We all have moments when we let our preconceptions guide us," she said kindly. "What matters is what we learn from those moments." A young black girl sitting in business class, who couldn't have been more than 8, had been watching the entire scene unfold with wide eyes. She slowly stood up in her seat, despite her mother's gentle tugging to make her sit down. "Are you really a pilot?" she called out, her voice full of wonder. Sarah turned to her with a warm smile. "Yes, I am. Would you like to know what it's like to fly a plane?" The girl nodded enthusiastically, and several other passengers leaned in to listen. Captain Martinez cleared his throat. "Sarah, why don't you take the jump seat in the cockpit? After we reach cruising altitude, perhaps you could share some of your experiences over the intercom. I think we could all learn something today." The tension that had filled the cabin minutes before was now replaced with a different kind of energy, one of anticipation and reflection. Lisa, though still embarrassed, found herself looking at Sarah with new eyes, seeing not just a black woman in a pilot's uniform, but a pioneer who handled prejudice with grace and turned it into a teaching moment. As Sarah finally made her way to the cockpit, followed by Captain Martinez, the passengers began settling into their seats. The incident had delayed their departure by several minutes, but somehow, no one seemed to mind anymore. They'd all sensed they were about to be part of something more significant than a routine flight from Atlanta to Chicago. James Morrison settled back into his first-class seat, a satisfied smile on his face. He pulled out his phone to text his granddaughter. She wouldn't believe who he'd just met again. The real story, however, was just beginning to unfold at 35,000 feet. When Sarah finally stepped into the terminal at O'Hare International Airport, she was met with a scene she hadn't expected. News cameras flashed, reporters held microphones, and a crowd of airport staff and travelers had gathered, many holding up their phones to capture the moment. But what caught Sarah's attention wasn't the media frenzy. It was a small group standing quietly to the side. They wore pilot uniforms from various airlines, and among them was Captain Janet Williams, one of the first black female commercial pilots in the United States, who had paved the way for others like Sarah. Janet stepped forward, her eyes glistening with emotion. "When I saw the video," she said, embracing Sarah, "I knew I had to be here. Some battles we fought 30 years ago are still being fought today, but it's how we fight them that makes all the difference." Behind them, Lisa emerged from the jet bridge, still in her flight attendant uniform. The crowd's attention shifted briefly, and several people began pointing and whispering. But before any negativity could build, Sarah did something unexpected. She waved Lisa over to join them. "This story isn't just about what went wrong," Sarah announced to the gathered reporters. "It's about what went right afterward. It's about Lisa, who showed us that growth and learning can come from our mistakes. It's about Mr. Morrison, who stood up when he saw something wrong. It's about every passenger on that flight who turned a moment of prejudice into an opportunity for understanding. The young girl from the flight, still clutching her tablet with the airplane drawings, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Can we stay and listen?" she asked. Her mother nodded, moving closer to hear Sarah's words. A reporter raised her hand. "Captain Chen, what message do you have for other minorities facing discrimination in their professional lives?" Sarah thought for a moment, looking at the diverse faces around her. "The easiest response to prejudice is anger," she said carefully. "The hardest and most powerful is to turn it into a teaching moment. Not just for the person showing prejudice, but for everyone watching and learning from the situation." Janet nodded in agreement, adding, "When I started flying in the 1980s, people would regularly mistake me for a flight attendant or even a cleaner. Each time, I had a choice: to let it defeat me or to use it as a chance to change perceptions. Sarah chose the latter today, and that's why we're all here." Lisa, who had been quiet until now, stepped forward. Her voice shook slightly, but her words were clear. "I want to say something," she announced. The cameras turned to her, and she took a deep breath. "I made a mistake today based on my own biases I didn't even know I had. But Captain Chen showed me that the response to ignorance doesn't have to be shame. It can be growth." The airport's operations director approached the group, holding a phone. "The video has reached 5 million views," he announced. "Airlines across the country are calling. They want to use this as a training example for their staff." Sarah looked at Lisa, then at Janet, and finally at the young girl with her tablet. "Perhaps that's the silver lining," she said. "One difficult moment can lead to thousands of important conversations." The crowd began to disperse, but not before something remarkable happened. Other pilots and flight attendants in the terminal, regardless of their airline, formed a line to greet Sarah and Lisa. It wasn't just about one incident anymore. It had become a moment of unity in an industry that still had progress to make. As the media packed up their equipment and the crowd thinned, Sarah noticed the young girl approaching shyly with her tablet. On it was a completed drawing, a plane soaring through clouds, with 2 pilots in the cockpit. One was clearly meant to be Sarah, and the other was the girl herself. "When I grow up," the girl said confidently, "nobody will be surprised to see me in a pilot's uniform." Sarah knelt down to the girl's level, looking at the drawing. "You're absolutely right," she said. "And you know what? The sky's getting bigger for all of us, one flight at a time." As they stood in the bustling terminal, surrounded by the gentle hum of airport announcements and rolling suitcases, Sarah realized that Flight 2314 hadn't just been a journey from Atlanta to Chicago. It had been a flight that might just help change the face of aviation, one conversation, one realization, and one dream at a time. The day wasn't over yet, and neither was the impact of what had happened aboard that flight. In fact, the most significant changes were just beginning to take wing. By evening, the story of Flight 2314 had taken on a life of its own. Major news networks were running special segments, and social media was ablaze with discussions about discrimination in professional settings. But in a quiet corner of O'Hare Airport's pilot lounge, a different kind of conversation was taking place. Sarah sat with Janet Williams and a group of pilots from various airlines, sharing experiences and stories that rarely made headlines. The room was filled with the aroma of coffee as they talked about their journeys in aviation. "You know," Janet said, stirring her coffee thoughtfully, "what happened today reminds me of my first year flying commercially. A passenger refused to board when he saw me in the cockpit. But what stayed with me wasn't his refusal. It was my co-pilot standing up for me." Lisa, who had been invited to join them after her shift ended, listened intently. Her uniform jacket was now draped over her chair, and she held her own cup of coffee with both hands, as if drawing strength from its warmth. "The airline CEO just called," Sarah announced to the group. "They want to launch a new initiative, Wings for All. It's going to be a mentorship program connecting experienced pilots with young people from underrepresented backgrounds." The news was met with enthusiastic nods and supportive comments. But it was what happened next that would add another unexpected layer to the day's events. A young man in a mechanic's uniform appeared at the door, looking nervous but determined. "Sorry to interrupt," he said, "but there's someone here who really wants to meet Captain Chen." Behind him stood a teenage girl in a wheelchair, wearing a shirt with an airplane on it. Her name was Maya, and she was part of a high school aviation club. She had been at the airport for a medical flight when she heard about what happened on Flight 2314. "I've been told I can't be a pilot because of my wheelchair," Maya said, her voice strong despite her nervousness. "But when I saw the video of how you handled that situation, Captain Chen, it made me think. Maybe the real barriers are the ones in people's minds." Sarah walked over to Maya, pulling up a chair to sit at her eye level. "You know what the first rule of aviation is?" she asked. Maya shook her head. "It's that gravity treats everyone exactly the same. What matters is how you learn to work with it." The other pilots began sharing stories of adaptive technologies in aviation, of pilots who flew with prosthetic limbs, and of how the industry was slowly but surely becoming more inclusive. Maya's eyes grew wider with each story. Meanwhile, Lisa had been quietly typing on her phone. She looked up with excitement. "The video from the flight has reached 10 million views," she announced. "But here's the amazing part. People are sharing their own stories in the comments. There's a hashtag trending. #MyFlightPath. Sarah pulled out her own phone and began reading some of the comments aloud. A black female surgeon who was mistaken for a nurse. A male kindergarten teacher who was questioned about his career choice. A woman engineer who was assumed to be the secretary. "It's not just about aviation anymore, is it?" Janet observed. "It's about all the spaces where people are told they don't belong." As the evening wore on, more airport staff drifted into the lounge. Mechanics, ground crew, air traffic controllers, each adding their own perspective to the conversation. The small room became a microcosm of the aviation world, filled with people from different backgrounds united by their love of flight. Maya's mother, who had been quietly observing, finally spoke up. "I've always worried about my daughter's dream of becoming a pilot," she admitted. "Not because I don't think she can do it, but because I was afraid of how the world would treat her. But being here, seeing this, it gives me hope." Sarah looked around the room, at Lisa, who had started the day making a mistake and was ending it as an ally, at Maya, whose determination shone brighter than any perceived limitations, at Janet, who had helped break down the initial barriers, and at all the others who had gathered to be part of this moment. "You know what I think?" Sarah said, addressing everyone in the room. "Today wasn't just about one incident on one flight. It was about all of us recognizing that change happens when we're brave enough to have difficult conversations, humble enough to learn from our mistakes, and determined enough to keep pushing forward." As night fell over O'Hare Airport, the lights of arriving and departing planes traced patterns across the dark sky. Inside the pilot's lounge, a new kind of flight plan was being drawn, one that would help guide the way toward a more inclusive future in aviation and beyond. The next morning, Sarah walked into the airline's headquarters in Chicago for what was supposed to be a routine meeting about the incident. Instead, she found herself in a conference room filled with airline executives, HR representatives, and diversity specialists, all eager to turn yesterday's events into meaningful change. The airline's CEO, Michael Thompson, stood at the head of the table. "Captain Chen," he began, "what happened yesterday has sparked a conversation that's long overdue. But we don't want this to be just another viral moment that fades away. We want real change." On the large screen behind him, clips from various news channels played silently. Interviews with passengers from Flight 2314, social media reactions, and most notably, the countless stories of similar experiences being shared across platforms. "I have a proposal," Sarah said, pulling out a notebook where she had jotted down ideas during her sleepless night. "But first, I'd like someone to join us." She walked to the door and invited Lisa in. The young flight attendant entered nervously, but Sarah gestured for her to sit beside her. "Real change," Sarah continued, "doesn't come from punishing mistakes. It comes from learning from them. Lisa and I have been talking, and we have an idea for a new training program." Lisa straightened in her chair and found her voice. "We're calling it Beyond the Uniform," she explained. "It's about looking past our initial assumptions and recognizing the humanity in everyone we meet." The room grew quiet as Sarah and Lisa outlined their plan. It wasn't just about diversity training. It was about creating real connections between different departments, encouraging mentorship, and establishing support systems for employees facing discrimination. As they spoke, Sarah's phone buzzed with a message. It was a photo from Maya's mother. Maya was at her first adaptive flying lesson, her face beaming with joy. Sarah showed the picture to the room. "This is why we need change," she said. Because somewhere out there, there's always someone being told they don't belong. And our response to these moments determines whether they give up or keep fighting. The CEO leaned forward, clearly moved. What do you need from us to make this happen? Before Sarah could answer, there was a commotion outside the conference room. The door opened, and in walks Janet Williams, accompanied by several other veteran pilots from different airlines. We heard there was a meeting about change, Janet said with a smile, and we thought you might need some historical perspective and some help moving forward. The next few hours were unlike any corporate meeting the airline had ever seen. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and most importantly, concrete plans were made. The Beyond the Uniform program would be implemented across all major airlines, with Sarah and Lisa leading the initial training sessions. But the most powerful moment came when they connected via video call with a group of high school students from an aviation program in Atlanta. Among them was the young girl from Flight 2314, now proudly wearing a pilot's cap. "Captain Chen," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the speakers. "Our whole class watched what happened on your flight. Our teacher says it's going to be in history books someday." Sarah smiled, remembering her own dreams at that age. "What happened on that flight is already history," she replied. "What matters now is what we do next." The meeting concluded with the signing of a new initiative, a partnership between major airlines to create more inclusive policies and support systems for employees from all backgrounds. Lisa would become one of the program's first trainers, turning her experience into a teaching tool for others. As people began filing out of the conference room, the CEO pulled Sarah aside. "You know," he said, "when I first heard about what happened on that flight, I was worried about bad publicity. But you've shown us that sometimes our most challenging moments can lead to our greatest progress." Sarah nodded, thinking about all the messages she'd received from people sharing their own stories of facing discrimination and finding the courage to stand up to it. "Tomorrow," she said, "I'm flying another route. And the day after that, and the day after that. Each flight is a chance to show someone that they belong in whatever space they dream of occupying." As she gathered her things to leave, Sarah paused to look out the window at the planes taking off and landing. Each one carried hundreds of stories, hundreds of dreams. And now, thanks to one difficult moment handled with grace, those dreams had a better chance of taking flight. The day was ending, but the work of real change was just beginning. And somewhere in the sky, another flight was carrying someone who needed to see that change was possible. 1 year later, Sarah Chen stood at the podium in a packed auditorium at the National Aviation Conference. Behind her, a screen displayed photos from Flight 2314 alongside images of what had happened since, training sessions, mentorship programs, and most importantly, faces of change throughout the aviation industry. "When I boarded that flight to Chicago last year," Sarah began, "I had no idea it would change not just my life, but the lives of so many others." She paused, scanning the audience. In the front row sat Lisa, now a senior trainer for the Beyond the Uniform program. Next to her was Maya, who had recently completed her first solo flight using adaptive controls. In the past year, our Wings for All initiative has provided mentorship to over 5,000 young people from underrepresented backgrounds. But more importantly, it has changed the way we think about who belongs in aviation. The statistics appeared on the screen behind her. A 40% increase in applications from minority candidates for pilot training programs, new adaptive technology programs for aspiring pilots with disabilities, and partnership agreements with 20 major airlines worldwide. In the middle of her speech, Sarah spotted a familiar face, the young girl from Flight 2314, now a year older and wearing the uniform of a student pilot program. She was sitting next to James Morrison, the retired pilot who had stood up for Sarah that day. He had become a regular speaker at aviation schools, sharing the story of Flight 2314 and its aftermath. But perhaps the most significant change, Sarah continued, isn't in the numbers. It's in the conversations we're having. It's in the way we handle those moments when our assumptions meet reality. Lisa stood up and joined Sarah at the podium. Together, they had become powerful advocates for change, their story serving as a reminder that growth often begins with acknowledging our mistakes. "A year ago, I made a mistake that could have ended my career," Lisa said to the audience. "Instead, it became the beginning of the most important work I've ever done. We trained over 10,000 airline staff members through Beyond the Uniform, and each session starts with my story, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that change is possible. The audience applauded as Maya wheeled herself onto the stage. She was wearing her pilot's wings, earned just the week before. When I saw the video of Flight 2314, Maya shared, I was ready to give up on my dream of flying. But Captain Chen showed me that barriers are meant to be broken. Today, I'm proud to announce that our airline is launching a new scholarship program for pilots with disabilities, named after that historic flight. As the conference concluded, Sarah found herself surrounded by a new generation of aviators, young people from all backgrounds who saw the sky as their home. The young girl from the flight rushed up to her, proudly showing her student pilot logbook. I flew for the first time last week, she announced, beaming. My instructor said I have natural talent. Sarah smiled, remembering her own first flight. The sky doesn't care what we look like, she said. It only cares that we have the courage to reach for it. Later that evening, at a small gathering of those who had been on Flight 2314, stories were shared about how that day had changed their lives. The video had become a teaching tool in aviation schools, and the phrase, beyond the uniform, had become shorthand for looking past appearances in all professional settings. Janet Williams, now retired but still active in mentoring, raised her glass in a toast. To Flight 2314, she said, the flight that proves sometimes the most important journeys aren't about where we're going, but about who we become along the way. Sarah looked around the room at the faces of those who had been part of this journey. Lisa, who had turned a mistake into a mission. Maya, who had refused to let anything ground her dreams. The young girl who now saw her future in the clouds. And countless others who had found their wings in the wake of that memorable flight. As the evening drew to a close, Sarah's phone buzzed with a notification. Another airline had just signed on to the Wings for All program. Change was happening, one flight at a time, one conversation at a time, one dream at a time. The story of Flight 2314 had become more than just a viral moment or a teaching tool. It had become a reminder that sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice isn't anger or resignation. It's the quiet determination to rise above it, helping others to soar along the way.